All right, guys, what is going on? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is June 30th of 2021. If this is your first time joining us, this is a live Q&A style show where I answer questions we get from our users about SaberSim, about DFS, about sports betting, really whatever you guys want to talk about. Sometimes we tilt some of our losses and celebrate our wins and sweat things out, especially on the Friday show when we're doing golf afternoon golf cut sweats. But yeah, no, this is just it's an open forum type show where I answer questions and we talk about DFS strategy and theory and how to do certain things on SaberSim. We get questions in through Slack in our office hours channel in Slack. We also get questions in through YouTube. So if you are watching here on YouTube and you have questions, always feel free to pop your questions into YouTube chat. And finally, we get questions in through our support email. So you are always welcome to email us, support@sabersim.com, if you've got a question about how to use SaberSim or how to build the most successful lineups possible. Always feel free to email us. I would highly recommend, if you are not already in our Slack community, you get joined up. The description of this video after it is finished and is published as a recording, we'll have a link to join our Slack community. It also, any of our past office hours videos also all have that link in the description. So if you are itching to get in, go check out any of the past videos. There's a link in the description of the video. You can get joined right up. There's always awesome conversation going on here in Slack every day. A lot of these questions that I end up answering on this show get asked initially in Slack, and sometimes there's a little bit of back and forth before and after the show with other members of the community. Really just awesome stuff, really strong, sharp community. So highly recommend joining up there. Let's see. I host the show every day here at 2 p.m. Eastern, Monday through Friday. On Thursdays, we typically use this time slot for what we've been calling a strategy session, where we dive deeper into a specific sport or concept or contest type or anything like that. Last week, I had Matt and Will on talking about some awesome improvements they've been working on to the baseball model this year and the great results we're seeing from that. So if you are playing baseball DFS, I highly recommend going and checking that video out. We've had a lot of positive feedback on that. Tomorrow on Thursday, I'm going to have Max back on the show, and we're going to be talking about some lineup building strategies on SaberSim for baseball. So kind of a wide topic, but we want to show off and explore some of the different ways that you can find success building successful lineups for baseball with SaberSim. Really kind of bring together a lot of the concepts we've been talking about in office hours in the past few weeks. So we want to touch on how to and the value of editing projections and moving sliders around and dealing with ownership and tweaking exposures and really give you guys a lineup building focused strategy session about different ways you can add value and do things on SaberSim to be successful. So particularly if you've been struggling this season so far figuring out how best to construct your lineups, maybe this is your first season playing baseball or you're relatively new to SaberSim, highly recommend checking that out. And of course, if you are one of our more advanced users, there is always a lot to offer in those strategy sessions. So I recommend checking it out either way, and always feel free to ask any questions you have in that. So a lot of baseball content continuing to come. That's kind of now where we are here getting into the heat of the summer. So if you have questions for that office hours stream tomorrow, over the next 24 hours here, go ahead and fire them off into our email, support@sabersim.com, or into the office hours channel in Slack. I know we're obviously probably going to be talking a little bit of baseball today, and that's okay too. But if you have something in particular about kind of lineup construction, how to build effective lineups, how to add value to your SaberSim process for baseball DFS, fire them off in the channel. We'll get to them tomorrow with Max. So very excited for that. And then this will actually be our last office hours episode of the week. We are going to be taking Friday off. Yours truly is actually going to be flying down to Mexico, getting a little beach time in over the weekend. So I'm going to be out for a couple days. Andy will pick it up for me here on Monday and Tuesday of next week. So you'll be here with Andy on Monday and Tuesday. We are going to take Friday off, but always feel free to pop any questions you have on Friday in to that channel over the weekend. Andy will go ahead and get to those on Monday, and you'll have me right back a week from today here on Wednesday. So anyway, already a lot of introductions here, a lot of housekeeping type stuff going on. We're about 5 minutes in. I've got a decent queue of questions here today. I've got a couple that have come in through support, a couple that I see in Slack. Always feel free to fire off any questions you have. I'll make sure we get to them. And I'm going to go ahead and just jump right in. So let's get SaberSim pulled up here, and let's get us started. All right, cool. We've got our app here up, and I'm actually going to start here. We've got some questions that came in through support. So the first question, this came in through John, and John had a question about some of these more niche contest types, things like showdowns and single game slates, and how to best use SaberSim to build lineups for those kinds of contests. So John specifically called out PGA showdown contests and FanDuel single games. So I'm just going to cover kind of some of the basics here of how to get started with that kind of thing. One of the coolest things about SaberSim is that, our builder, taking into account the impacts of correlation where it is appropriate, ownership and smart diversity, allows us to be very flexible, adjusting to different contest types and sizes and all those things. So we will typically have all of the different slates for a given sport and day that we are supporting up here in this little drop down. So John, you mentioned how to build or how to get started building showdown lineups for golf. I wasn't sure if this was more of like a literal not having trouble finding the slate or more of a strategy question. So just in case, you can use this drop down to specify your specific slate that you're looking for. And in this case, if you were looking to build lineups for the round 1 PGA showdown, you could go ahead and navigate over to here and you'll see projections update accordingly. We have ownership for a lot of these niche sports, which is really nice too. And then you can go ahead and click in here and build. We'll even have default sliders for different contest sizes that we think makes sense. From there, I know you had asked how to build kind of effective lineups for these different contest types. Obviously, every single one of these is going to be a little bit of its own discussion. There's going to be things that relate to golf showdowns that maybe don't necessarily relate as well to FanDuel NBA single game slates, right? But the beautiful thing here is because we have these default sliders that adjust dynamically to your contest size, I highly recommend as you're getting into some of these more niche contest types, just to try what we call a test build, which is to go in, select the kind of contest you're going to play. So maybe we're playing a 20 max between 1,000 to 10,000 entrants for the golf round 1 showdown, and just allow the builder to build 20 lineups that it thinks makes sense for the contest. It's going to build a pool of 500 and select its favorite 20. And you're going to get to see a general idea of how the lineups are constructed for this contest, how we feel is an appropriate construction. You can look at things like how many players are in my player pool, how exposed am I to the highest players in my player pool, how am I handling the chalkiest plays on the slate? Those kinds of things. And from there, start to get an image of what we think are the appropriate types of contests to play for each individual slate. So real quick here, I mean, we can do the same thing. I know in your email, you specifically called out NBA FanDuel single game. So we can do the same thing here, right? So we can go ahead and switch over to the FanDuel single game tonight. And the same rules are going to apply. We're going to set sliders that we think they're appropriate for contests. We're going to have our projections and everything are going to adjust automatically to what makes sense for the contest. We'll have ownership almost 100% of the time for these niche sports, which is really useful and really helpful. And we can run a test build and go ahead and start to get familiar with the kinds of lineups that we think are viable for the contest. I think maybe from there, as you begin to play around and get more familiar with what kinds of these lineups look like, I'd be happy to answer any sport or site or contest type specific strategy questions that you might have, or if you have questions about why you're getting a certain player or certain lineups or anything like that, happy to talk about that though. So in summary, you can always use these drop downs here at the top to navigate around, get to your specific sport. We offer a wide variety of different sport types and things like that. You can see, I think we've even got some of these second half only slates here. I don't know if these are fully supported. I don't think they are. They have the actual projections for the full game in here. But we've got a wide variety of sport types here, and the default sliders are going to be a great place to start in dialing in those build settings and giving you lineups that have win equity in those contests. So, John, let me know if that helps. If you have any other questions, happy to answer anything specific about specific sports or sites, as I mentioned, or anything like that. So, cool. I am going to move us along to our next question. This also came in through support. And I think I ran this sneaky FanDuel single game build because that is what the next question is about. about. So this one came in from Alex here on support, and he said, let's see, I'll just go ahead and paste the question in here. I realized I didn't do that for the first one, so I probably should have. He asked, what is the correct procedure to edit after lineup builds are created in step 2 for min-max exposures? I'm having problems where lineups are created, and for example, there is only one single MVP selection at 100%. And sure enough, here I've got, I assume, Alex, I think this was for yesterday's Bucks-Hawks slate, but I'm going to do this with the Suns and Clippers here for tonight's slate. You can see here, we do indeed have Paul George here at 100% locked into that MVP slot. I'm going to back us up real quick and talk a little bit about why this is. It relates to the FanDuel scoring. You're going to see this as a similar trend. Because FanDuel allows for you to play players at the multiplier positions without paying more for them. In other words, salary does not go up. The difference between the highest projected player on the slate and the second highest projected player on the slate is exaggerated at the multiplier positions. We see this difference between Paul George and Chris Paul, the next closest player, goes from about 10 points to over 20 points difference at the MVP slot. And that value is that change is exaggerated because the proportional difference between the salaries has not moved at all, right? So you are often going to see that our builder believes that the optimal way to play these FanDuel single game slates is to play the highest projected play at the MVP slot 100% of the time. There's a few things you can do, obviously, if you want to spread this out and spread out some of your risk here. So I'm going to first show, if you've just built this build and you see that you've got 100% and you want to start making adjustments to these exposures here, one thing you can do is adjust this lineups here. So we have 20, but we have a pool of 500, and you can adjust this to 500. And it will give you an idea of all of the different players that we have exposure to at the MVP slot. And give you a little bit of a better idea of where there are opportunities to move things around. So in this particular case, we actually have a lot of other MVPs in our pool. So if we went back to 20 and maybe adjusted, I think the original email said you were trying to have a balanced 3 different MVPs. So if we ended up going and adjusting this to like 34, we have enough players in the pool that at MVP that we could actually get away with doing this, and this is going to work just fine. Now, if you went over here, and I think this was more of a situation yesterday because Giannis was so much higher projected than the next player once Trae Young got ruled out. If this was over here and this said 90% Paul George or something like that, we are simply not going to have a lot of lineups for you to play with in this entire pool to go in and start adding exposures. Even if you do go ahead and start to add in max exposures to Paul George, it's just going to dry up. There's not a lot of total other lineups in the pool. It's going to dry up rather quickly you're just not going to have a lot of lineups that aren't a Paul George MVP lineup. So always a good thing to check there to give you an idea of how flexible your entire pool is. If you have an inflexible pool and you really want to make some changes overall, there's a few things you can do. The first thing is to take the player that you have showing up as all of your MVPs and to simply bring his projection down a little bit. So if we brought Paul George down maybe to something that isn't so high above every other player in the pool, we're going to get a much more flexible pool when we run it with a lot more different MVP options. The alternative option, of course, would be to bump up if you know what players you want to be in your pool. I think in this particular email, it mentioned that that Alex wanted one MVP at 40%, one at 32%, and one at 28%. If you know what those 3 players are beforehand, you can also take the opposite approach and bump those players up. Maybe it's Paul, Booker, and George, and go from there and get more of those players in your pool. Finally, I would say the last kind of option here is to go check your settings. First of all, make sure that your smart diversity is very high for these kinds of contests. Because there are so few players in the pool overall, even at a very high smart diversity, you can get relatively condensed player exposures. Just there's not a lot of players to choose from. If you drop this smart diversity down and even get into moderate or low, you're going to have extremely condensed lineups that don't leave you a lot of room to edit your exposure. So I would keep your smart diversity very high. And finally, the last thing you can do is if you just kind of want to know that you have a wide player pool overall, is take advantage of this max exposure tool. If we set our max exposure at 50, for example, it's going to ensure that we don't have, of the entire pool of 500, more than 50% of any one MVP. You can go a little bit lower here too. I wouldn't go too much lower because it can start, especially on a small slate, again, single game where there's not a ton of viable options. It can start to create you sometimes a little bit weird lineups to fit that rule. But you can go in here and set this. 40 is going to ensure that no more than 200 lineups of your entire pool of 500 have any one MVP in it, which means you're going to have a lot of flexibility. It's going to play a little bit more nicely with your exposures overall. So that is kind of how I would summarize that. I would also just kind of to circle back here, remind you that this does come from the nature of the way FanDuel scores these contests and sets these contests up and how it handles their salary. On those days where the builder is maybe recommending, even of your giant pool of 500, 90% Giannis MVP or something like that, sometimes that is a sign that that is the optimal way to play, just because that multiplier is essentially free and you are getting 2x on a play that is already the highest projected play on the slate. Obviously, you can continue to spread out your risk and exposures there a little bit, but something to consider there too. If maybe that's an indication that instead the way to get different is at the star, pro, or utility spots than the MVP spots. But lots of ways to spread out that exposure. Sometimes it requires you going back and adjusting projections or using some slightly different build settings. So, Alex, hopefully that was helpful. If you end up watching this recording back here and anything's confusing or you're still running into trouble, just let me know. Happy to help. Let me make sure that I kind of got through. Yeah, there were a couple other notes here in your email, Alex. So I think I've kind of covered everything, but definitely just shout out if there's something I'm still missing here or if you still have a question. So cool. I'm going to continue to move us forward here. I see I've got plenty of questions, so we will get to everyone here. I'm going to go ahead and actually jump here to Lionheart's question, just because, again, it is very similar to what we just discussed. And I'm not going to review all of this identically over again, but he asked, what is the key to not running into lineup constraints when attempting to change player exposure, post-build, and even expanding lineup pool doesn't help? Lower correlation, lower smart diversity. Okay, let's talk about this. I'm going to take a baseball approach to this one. It's going to be a bit of a similar question here that we just kind of answered, but let's run a DraftKings build for the main slate tonight. So first off, since you mentioned them in here, I would definitely avoid doing either of these things. Correlation in this case isn't going to have an impact on your overall player pool. Higher correlation can make lineups a little bit more rigid because they force stacks, but we need stacks in our baseball lineups, right? So I wouldn't do that. And lower smart diversity is definitely not the right thing. I would actually say one thing that maybe would help would be to raise smart diversity, right? Raising smart diversity increases the overall diversity of our lineups. It means that our pool has a wider range of different players in it. When we start going in and setting those different exposures, it's going to give us a variety of lineups from which to work with and from which to pull from. So one thing you can do right off the bat is actually to raise your smart diversity if you are not getting a lineup pool as diverse as you want. So I'm going to go ahead and build this now, and we'll talk about some of the same principles we just talked about here from a baseball perspective. Things are a little bit different when we're not talking about a single game, first of all, and also FanDuel's relatively unique single game scoring and salary system here. So this is just DraftKings main slate. But we'll give this a moment to build here, and then we'll talk about some things that you can do if you're seeing that message. So just a minute here. I do want a full big pool of 500 lineups for this. So okay, so same deal here right off the bat, right? We can immediately see we're getting 100% Aaron Nola. We clearly are partial to Seattle stacks. You can begin to see we have some players that are 100% exposed. We can immediately go ahead and adjust this to 500 and get an idea of what the overall pool looks like for our players, right? So yes, we had 100% Aaron Nola in 20 lineups, but in reality, we have just under 50% Aaron Nola in all of our lineups here in the pool. So as an example, if we decided we wanted to fade Nola, we could do that and put a 0 here. But we have immediately reduced all of the remaining lineups we had in half. We now have essentially around 250 lineups from which to play with. You are going to put additional strain on the product to find lineups that fit what you are trying to do in this step 3 here. The more lineups that you kind of remove as viable options here from your pool, right? So now you can see all of a sudden we have 80% Musgrove. And if we remove Musgrove, it's probably going to be okay. But now we've reduced the remaining lineups in the pool even further. And if we reduce Luis Garcia, we're going to reduce lineups even further. And we're still okay here, right? We haven't seen the message, but you can get an idea of how many lineups you have available to play with here and where you're going to put additional strain on the builder overall by immediately looking at your entire pool here and getting an idea of why you're seeing that message. One thing to note here is I saw there's a note in the question that says even expanding lineup pool doesn't help. The reason that is, and an important thing to note here is in the step 3 is when you see that message that says, would you like to build more lineups? It is going to build you more lineups. It's typically a subset of your original pool. So I think if you have 500 built, it tries to build you 50 more. It is going to build you those 50 lineups with the same projections and the same build rules you used in the first place. So it's essentially kind of a brute force approach that works best if you really just need to get like 1 or 2 extra lineups in your pool to meet your conditions. If you are making a lot of exposure changes or you are going dramatically against what the builder wants you to do, it's not going to really help that much building 50 additional lineups because, for example, say you wanted immediately to eliminate Nola, Musgrove, and Garcia, and maybe Bassett and all these players. And I'm just going to do this until I see that message, right? I'm just removing the highest pitcher, the highest exposure pitcher until I see the message, right? We've eliminated basically what the builder's favorite 8 players were all at once. If we continue building and click this here, the lineups that it proceeds to build are probably going to include a lot of the pitchers that we just eliminated, right? So how you can handle this, I would say a few things. First of all, let's see if it works. So it built us 20 more and it didn't work, right? It didn't find additional lineups that had those pitchers because it likes those pitchers. So a few things you can do. I mentioned already, higher smart diversity is going to have a generally more diverse pool to begin with. It's going to give you more room to work with. If you are eliminating players that the builder really likes, or you are forcing exposure to players that the builder doesn't really like, again, you can use viewing your entire pool to get an idea of how much the builder likes players. You may be better served going in and dropping or increasing projections for those players. So we can go ahead and look. And if we know that we don't really want to play any of the top 4 pitchers and we are crossing off a lot of lineups in step 3 that have those pitchers, it may be a better approach to drop the projections of all these guys and allow the builder to more organically lower your exposure to those players in the first place, right? That will make sure that all of the lineups in your pool are built with your actual overall image of the slate, rather than trying to cherry pick the specific lineups that were built out of step 1 that fit the exposures that you're trying to force into it. We like to think about step 1 as building the foundation of the building or the house. And step 3 is kind of the final quality control or the house inspection, right? If you find a bunch of issues in your inspection or in your quality control, there's not that much you can do at that point to resolve the foundation, right? It makes more sense to go back, start with a brand new foundation, build a build that represents more of what your image of the slate is, and then tweak and dial in your quality control in step 3. So finally, the last point I was going to make here is one of the last things you can do is, again, we talked about this max exposure. You noticed our highest exposed player in our last build was Aaron Nola, only at 47%. So this doesn't always have an impact at 50% if you are building lineups for a sport like baseball that's pretty diverse on a bigger slate where there's a lot of players in a pool. But we can get this a little more diverse by maybe dropping this down to 30 or 40 and increasing the overall diversity of our lineups here. So in summary, right, I think this question comes up often. So I would say view your entire pool and see what the overall flexibility of what the builder has given you is. If you are trying to make dramatic changes from what the builder wanted to do, go back to step one, either drop the projections of certain players or raise projections of others. And then in step two, adjust some of your build settings by either increasing your smart diversity or lowering your max exposure to force the builder to give you a larger overall, a more diverse pool. As a SaberSim user, I would say it should generally be indicative to you that you have maybe don't have a strong foundation if you are seeing that message in step three, right? Foundation meaning your build, right? Your build is not set up in a way that is in line with the way you're viewing the slate and want to build lineups. So it probably makes sense to go back to either step one or two and update projections or build settings to draw it more in line with the way you're viewing the slate. And then the builder will be able to find the lineups that you want as you are fine tuning in step three a little bit easier. So last note on this before I move on. If you are the kind of player that wants a exposure setting on almost every single player in the pool, it is not always the easiest experience in step three, and we are aware of that, right? I mentioned that full-on fading a player that maybe the builder really liked or trying to force a ton of ownership to exposure to a player that the builder didn't really like can be difficult on the builder. There is also a kind of death by 1,000 cuts idea that if we have a minimum or maximum exposure on almost every player in the pool, even if it's not very different than what we got originally, that can also show the message, right? Just because there are so many limitations on the builder that it's difficult for it to find lineups even in 500 that fit. We know that there are players that kind of play that way, that have an idea of what those exposures look like even prior to the build. And we are working behind the scenes here on kind of getting some better overall control for players that want an exposure limit on every single player in the pool. That should be coming in one of our next future releases. For now, I would say probably the best thing to do is to use some combination of tweaking projections up or down slightly to really get those exposures dialed in the way you want them to. So Lionheart, I don't know if you were able to catch all this live. Hopefully that was helpful to you. Oh, I see you actually responded to me. I missed you. Pitcher, I can get it to do what I want. It's getting the crappy stacks that aren't projected well when I want to get 5 to 10% of them. Yeah. So with that, I would say like one thing you can very much do is just go back here. And if you maybe say you wanted some access to Baltimore today, maybe particularly as leverage against Luis Garcia or something like that, one thing you can just do is just bump this team total up maybe to another team that's not super highly projected. You can still remember, it's always important to remember that you can dial this in on step three once you are at least just getting some of them. So maybe even if you take them to 4.5 runs and then run a build, you will just get more access to Baltimore. And then from there, you can kind of dial in your exposures as you see fit in step three. It's also, we'll talk about this a little bit more tomorrow in our lineup building strategy, but it's important to note that step three is a matter of selection, right? We are selecting certain lineups that fit within a range of parameters that you've set in step three, right? But that doesn't control well for things like Saber score and your overall sorting, right? Like if we go ahead and let's say we just limit Aaron Nola to 10% here as an example. Actually, let's limit him to 10%, right? So the builder clearly likes Aaron Nola. Right now we have 100% Aaron Nola, and our top lineup in our entire pool is an Aaron Nola lineup, right? I'm actually spoiling one of the fun things I wanted to talk about yesterday, but that's fine. It's relevant. So Aaron Nola, our most owned pitcher, our top lineup is an Aaron Nola lineup. If we drop this down to 10%, so we've significantly restricted our exposure to Nola. Our top pitcher is now Joe Musgrove. He's 75% owned. But our first two lineups are still Aaron Nola lineups, right? So, and then we make a jump from the second ranked lineup to the 40th ranked lineup. The builder still believes this is a profitable lineup to play in the contest. It's 40th out of 520. It's still probably a very good lineup. But as you add exposure settings and tweak your exposures around here, you kind of disrupt the flow of your overall Saber score sorted lineups, right? Having an Aaron Nola lineup as our number one lineup now, when we are taking a underweight stand, can be a little bit awkward, especially even if you're using the rank sorting method and using this lineup in a lot of different contests or something like that. So by going back to step one, here, wrapping around to my point here, by going back to step one and bumping up the projections or down the projections of certain players or teams that you want or don't want, you get a more balanced and more flat lineup portfolio because the builder has this information beforehand, before you even start. So Lionheart said, yes, thank you. Yeah, no problem. I know that's a little confusing. We do have some more improvements here coming to make this overall a little bit of a smoother experience. But if you are operating kind of with the reminder that everything that takes place in step one is building out that foundation of how you want to attack the slate. Even if you run a build, see what happens and come back, right? We recommend that. That's a great way to do it. Come back to step one, dial things in, how you want to view the slate, how you want to attack the slate. And then step three, quality control, right? Tweaking things in, adjusting exposures here and there, maybe dialing things down or bumping things up just slightly. It's a great approach. So. All right, we are cruising right along here. I see I've still got some other questions here coming in, so that is great. I'm going to just keep it going. This question came in from Neil earlier this morning. And he said, can you talk about how to properly identify the construction on FanDuel, especially whenever it's a bigger slate? I think because of the prices, it makes it hard to identify the chalk construction for me. Neil, you are pretty sharp there. In general, I would say FanDuel can be a little trickier, I think, personally. At least I haven't played FanDuel in some time. I'm kind of all in on DraftKings. But when I used to play FanDuel heavily, it was my first site I played. Their prices for players always seemed much softer to me than DraftKings, which meant that ownership got a little bit harder to assess, and just finding the chalk got a little bit harder to assess, right? Everybody was pretty well priced. Like everyone was maybe not, it's not even an efficiency problem. It's like everyone is inefficiently priced, so all the plays are good. That's how I've always felt playing FanDuel. Where DraftKings, their pricing is extremely efficient, which means that when there is a misprice or a value, it really stands out in the slate, and the chalk gets very easily identifiable. But there are a few tools that we can use that I think can kind of help you to identify where the chalk's going to go, what the common constructions are. Also, I love that you kind of mentioned construction here too. It's such an important point when you're thinking about the way you're attacking a slate, rather than what the chalky plays are, what the chalky constructions are. So let's talk a little bit about how we can do that. I like, for baseball in particular, I like for to start with the pitcher and allow that to kind of guide my understanding of the slate from there. Mostly just because a lot of salary can be committed to pitching, and because we are stacking in baseball, it doesn't always make sense to try to handle this looking at position by position what the chalk looks like. So I like to start with pitcher, and you can do that by just simply selecting pitcher and sorting by projected ownership and getting an idea of what the slate looks like, right? So this actually looks a little bit different than it did. I see we updated our projections here. It looks a little bit different than what it did before when I was preparing for this. But you can see how it's kind of unfolding now. We think that Nola is kind of by far going to be the chalkiest. And again, FanDuel is a one pitcher site, right? So most people are going to pay up and get to Nola. We have a more affordable option here in Musgrove. That's probably going to be the next most popular. And then maybe like a little bit of a trickle of people still paying for that top end pitcher here. But pivoting off of Nola to either like Garcia or Bassett, right? And it seems like, at least for FanDuel, those are going to be kind of the construction. So it's a pay up for pitcher night where a lot of the ownership is concentrated at the high dollar pitchers with a like single relief pitcher option, right? So again, FanDuel's pricing is kind of inefficient a lot of times. So what I would typically say here, especially for something maybe like DraftKings, is that expensive pitchers implies cheaper stacks. But sometimes you can just get the cheaper stacks, or sometimes you can just get almost whatever stacks you want on FanDuel, even if you're paying up for pitcher, just because it's that easy, right? So from there, we have an idea of kind of what the constructions I think theoretically look like, right? People are probably either paying up for Nola and going a little bit cheaper at their hitters, or they're going down to Musgrove to gain a little bit more access to maybe some expensive bats, or they're taking a pivot. They're paying the high dollar pitcher, but they're taking a pivot off of Nola, right? That's really what we're seeing is the popular constructions. Those are probably going to be the chalky constructions. One thing you can actually do, and this is also stealing a little bit of thunder from, unfortunately, tomorrow's strategy session, but we can actually use the builder as a tool to see what certain chalky constructions look like. And how I would recommend doing that is literally setting your builder to what a cash game build would look like, right? Cash game would be 0-0-0, no concerns about ownership, full on chalky builds, but then setting a stack rule for yourself that says you have to build 4 stacks. And we can see, we'll even maybe let this build 100 of these. We can get an idea of what is the chalkiest constructions going to look like, right? Smart diversity is all the way at 0. We're not going to get a lot of variety here. We're basically going to see like, what is the easiest chalky construction to create on the slate tonight. And let's give this a moment to run. I'm building 100 because I just want to see a few more lineups, so it will take a moment. But this can actually be a very valuable tool here, setting a build like this and running it after you've done a little bit of initial analysis to get an idea and actually have the builder try to build lineups in a way that is going to, one, mimic how typical optimizers are going to do it, right? We have all the build settings to the far left. We're going to be building basically mean projected optimal lineups with a stacking rule built in. It's going to be very similar to what a typical optimizer might do. And we can take a look and see what actual constructions look like, right? It's hard to look at all the salaries and the players and even the projected ownership and get an idea of how lineups get constructed, but we can do that very, very quickly. If Max is watching along, he's going to be so upset. I'm stealing his thunder a little bit. This is his idea. I got this from Max. We'll talk about this a lot more tomorrow too. These are kinds of the things that we wanted to talk about in our strategy session tomorrow. So if you're enjoying this, if this is useful to you, definitely tune in tomorrow because we've got a lot more of this, including what I was talking about before with, I can't remember. I mentioned stealing something from tomorrow earlier too. I can't remember what it is now, but. All right, we don't need that many lineups here. That's plenty. Let's go ahead and look. So you can see, right, we're not getting a very diverse pool, right? But the builder is going to imply that Aaron Nola is probably going to be very chalky, right? It's going to be the most popular construction. And the stacks that people are getting to are primarily going to be San Diego, which unsurprisingly looks to me a little too affordable. But I mean, we see we're getting Pham at 3,000, Trent Grisham at 3,100, Will Myers at 2,500, Tatis at 46, right? This is kind of what I mean. So it's almost all San Diego chalks. This is kind of what I mean when I say that FanDuel has inefficient pricing, right? Is it's very easy to get the most expensive pitcher with the highest upside on the slate, put in a hugely productive team, and build lineups from there. So that's another great way. Like I would say now we have an idea of probably what the chalk construction is going to end up looking like. It's probably Nola with a Padre stack is probably the chalkiest build. So the last thing I'll talk about, and this is a little bit distanced from construction and more on just teams, is to take a look at Vegas too. It's always a good idea. The one thing I would want to make sure on is we were obviously building projections there with SaberSim's projections, right? Which don't use Vegas odds and sometimes can be different from Vegas. It can be a good idea to just double check here and make sure that you are on the same page, right? I would say two things that I would want to check here is to make sure that the Marlins have a very low implied total if we're thinking that Nola is going to be that owned. And they do. They're 3-4. The Tigers are also 3-4, but that game's not on the slate. I think it's probably pretty realistic. And then along with like a guy like Luis Garcia or Bassett, right? I think we're assessing the chalk probably well there. Nola's probably going to be very highly owned. The one thing that maybe hops out to me here, looking at the other games on the slate, is that we do have the Padres at 5.8 runs. It probably stands to reason that they are going to be chalky. But there are teams that we have higher than that. The Astros, the Red Sox, the Blue Jays. So it's definitely possible that maybe some of those other teams end up being a little bit more chalky there, but I think we've done a good job to overall get an idea of what the chalk constructions are going to look like, right? I mean, there's realistically the 4 pitching options that are going to soak up a ton of the ownership. People are going to run that back with a big 4 stack of Toronto, San Diego, Houston, or Red Sox, right? So, and now we have an idea of maybe how to attack that. So, let's see. Neil, don't know if you had a chance to catch this live here. If not, I'll make sure you get a recording. As always, let me know if there are any questions on the other side of that. I'm happy to follow up, talk about this a little bit more. And if this is interesting to you, highly recommend either checking us out live tomorrow when we do our strategy session or checking out the recording of that, of course, after it's posted, because we are going to be talking about this kind of stuff for most of the hour tomorrow. So it should be a lot of fun. Okay, let's keep it rolling. Question from Christopher Nash here in a YouTube chat. Do you think it's wise to drop batting order positions off, or would you always leave 1 through 9 in? I always leave 1 through 9 in, personally. We can look. I think it is overstated the impact between two players in a batting order. Let's look at the Padres here. Oh, wait. Especially at their ceiling outcomes, right? So let's look at the ceiling outcomes for Padres players. Maybe they have an 85th percentile outcome as a team. There are sometimes low outliers. Catchers often don't hit well. That's a player that you can see maybe doesn't hit well. But if we're looking at this right through the order, at the ceiling outcome, these player projections don't differ enough consistently on a batting order basis, right? Obviously, Tatis is the highest projected player on the Padres, right? He's the best player on the Padres. He's going to pop a little bit more. He hits higher in the order, but your average first batter doesn't necessarily hit much better at his ceiling outcome than your average 7-hole batter in a way that would make me want to remove them. Or if we pick an AL team, so we can actually have that 9 spot, right? Yeah, sure, Gardner's a little bit lower, but we've got at the 85th percentile outcome, LeMahieu projected at 22 points. Actually, LeMahieu and Andujar are at the exact same projection for their ceiling outcome, right? You also get a lot of lower ownership on those lower batting order guys. People don't often go down to stack those guys. You can get some more creative stacks, like 8, 9, 1, 2 stacks sometimes that are players that hit in the order but aren't like visually next to each other, that sometimes people forget about. So I don't think you need to do that. I know some folks do. I think we had a question a couple weeks ago about someone that said that they limit the batting order hitters in the stack. And just in case you don't already know this, you can actually do this natively here by setting a stacking rule. We have at least 4 players from the same team. You can eliminate certain batting order spots from this. So we'll only stack maybe the top 6 or something like that. We had a user that said that he wanted to avoid more than 1 batting order spot gaps. I don't think you need to necessarily do that either. I know there are some pros that do that. I think it just overall limits you from certain constructions that have win equity and with little to gain. I think it gets you a little chalkier. I think your ceiling does not go up very much at all, and you remove yourself from lineup constructions that could have won, right? Especially if you're on the right team. Like if we're looking at the Yankees, maybe it's the Yankees tonight, right? And like, would anybody be surprised if Andujar has his 85th percentile outcome and hits 22, and he's the highest scoring player on the Yankees, and you had the right team, and you kind of just crossed off the bottom hitting players, right? I don't know. So not my thing, but we can do it. That's kind of, I think, the important point here. You can do it very easily if you want to. So, and you can also do it again, before I move us along, you can do it team by team too, right? I think that's maybe one point where you could really make a strong case, is maybe if you're playing some teams that are lower projected, right? You want some exposure to the teams that aren't in objectively good hitting spots tonight. Like maybe especially for leverage teams, right? This would be a good way. So we've already identified that the chalk pitchers are Nola, Musgrove, Garcia, Bassett. So maybe our leverage opportunities are Miami, Baltimore, Texas, and the Reds. Maybe we were doing something like this. Let's put our settings back to normal. And maybe we're doing at least a 4 stack from the same team, and we're only looking at those teams. And since we're already getting so much leverage by picking these particular 4 teams, maybe we're just doing a minor stack, right? And maybe we've decided we only want the top 5 guys. Something like that. I could see that being useful. I think on DraftKings, actually, we actually have an exposure option there. I didn't see it on the FanDuel side. I don't know if it's missing from FanDuel because that's actually what I wanted to show in particular. Oh, no. I must have been thinking of something else. But maybe in that particular case, right, if you're setting a stacking rule for a team that's already going to be really low owned, that has a very low chance of success relative to the field, maybe you limit then by only having the top 5 batters in that and just hope that you kind of get the best projected guys. But I don't think it's necessary. You end up getting the best projected guys most of the time anyway. So, but cool. Let's keep it rolling here. 45 minutes in. I think I've got one other question in my queue here. So I will answer that, but let me know if there are any other questions here as we're getting into the final quarter of the show here today. Always, I mentioned it every day. It goes so fast. We just have so much fun in here. It just flies right by. But let's see. So this was from Andrew. He said, going back to leverage, I like about what you said about how there are 2 sides to leverage, having less than the field, but also having more. Reminds me of playing GTO poker versus exploitative. How do you think about this in single entry when your exposure is obviously 100%? Are you comparing ownership to prize pool percentages? Yeah, it's interesting, right? I think so. If you missed it, I guess, first of all, Andrew's saying kind of going back to leverage here. The first 2 days of this week, yeah, it's Wednesday. On Monday and Tuesday of this week, we've been talking a lot about leverage here. We had a question come in on Monday that kind of got the ball rolling, talked about some overall definitions of leverage. On Tuesday, yesterday, talked a little bit more about some practical cases of how we can apply that definition to start getting some more leverage in our lineup. So continue to kind of follow up that conversation today. It's clear that Andrew here has watched those, so I'm going to kind of answer that with the point of view that you've already seen those segments of the shows. But if you haven't, they're timestamped up on YouTube as soon as I hop off today, or now, if you want to, feel free to jump back and watch those. But let's go ahead and talk about this a little bit. So I guess the real question is, how do you think about this in single entry when your exposure is obviously 100%? Are you comparing ownership to prize pool percentages? Yeah, this is where it gets hard, and why yesterday on the show I mentioned that I think the best way to use this in a practical way that's useful for you while also staying sane is to take more of an intuitive approach rather than a super analytical calculation type approach in determining the leverage spots. I'll talk about single entry from a few different perspectives here. The first being, if you are playing single entries and you are playing many of them, you can treat your single entry contest selection portfolio as a bit of a multi-entry contest for you only, right? And I do that. I like that strategy quite a bit. So if I'm playing the $1, $2, $3, $5, $10, and the $25 contests for single entries, that's 6 lineups, I think. You can kind of treat that as a 6 max and move things around and maybe just send your highest Saber score lineup into the most expensive dollar contest, but kind of still think about it as a way that you can build a portfolio. You can set exposures, right? I am a MME player by heart. So that is kind of the natural way I always think about that. But let's just assume you are truly playing a single entry contest and how to apply concepts of leverage. I would say a few things. First of all, in a single entry, you're going to see that ownership fade goes down. Smart diversity comes down a little bit, right? The need to be leveraged against the field can drop a little bit here just because players get closer to the chalkier plays, right? They have less plays overall to work with. In a single entry contest, when you have a single lineup, leverage is kind of a spectrum, right? Like if we're playing, let's say we're playing a FanDuel single entry or DraftKings, I guess it doesn't matter. We'll stay on DraftKings. Let's say we're playing a single entry contest on DraftKings, right? For a single entry, oh, this isn't the right slate. NOLA is going to be pretty popular, right? Having NOLA or not having NOLA is in effect a maybe a way to already be leveraged against the field enough, right? It maybe is not necessarily true that we need to have Marlins bats. We don't need to go the full other direction, right? In a single entry, you can only roster 2 pitchers. You have this binary on-off switch where you are massively over the field on 2 pitchers and under the field on every other pitchers because you have one lineup to work with, right? So I think that's kind of the other thing that pops into my head here is that like we can take a strong where everything is kind of a strong stand when you're just building a singular lineup. So we don't need to be as negatively leveraged as a portion of our pool of lineups like we would in MME on a single entry contest. Andrew, I see you asked here, are you comparing ownership to prize pool percentages? I don't know exactly what that question is asking. I would say single entries are also going to have flatter payout structures overall most of the time, which is part of the reason we like to play them. So I mentioned yesterday talking about where the prize pools are spread out, only playing the amount of entries that make sense that you can be profitable. That's another reason why we don't need to be as necessarily leveraged against the field in single entry, because more of the prizes are paid out to flatter payout structures overall. Our need to handle ownership in that way goes down a little bit for single entry. But yeah, again, I honestly, I don't know the last time I sat down and played a slate with literally a single bullet in a single entry. I almost always am either playing max entry contests, or I'm playing a portfolio of single entry and 3 maxes that I end up treating as one build and building as if I'm kind of playing if it's 7 single entries and 3 maxes together, it's as if I'm playing a 7 max, and that kind of allows me to think about my exposures a little bit more. Yeah, it's an interesting question there. Again, I would continue. I think the easiest way to look at it is to ask yourself, is the ownership equivalent to the percent chance that player is the number 1 player at their position, right? So on DraftKings, you have 2 pitchers, right? Is it a 33% chance or greater that Aaron Nola is one of the top 2 pitchers amongst this group of pitchers? And if the answer is yes, you should roster him. And with a single entry, it may just only take 1 point of leverage or something like that, right? And that's actually how a lot of the single entry contests are going to just be built. So if we just remove the rule and let's say single entry, right? So ownership fade is actually going to be pretty low because it's a big slate, but let's build 10 lineups and just look at these. The builder out of the box is actually going to kind of do a lot of this for you. It's going to like find that 1 point of leverage on the field. Maybe it's fading like one of the chalkier pitchers, the chalky stack. Maybe it's using like a couple one-offs, things like that. So, but we'll give this a second to build and take a look at this. So we went 100% Nola here, right? So obviously, if we were truly just picking out a single lineup for us that we were going to play in one single entry, we're massively over the field on Nola. We are actually even with 10. But if we were literally just going to play one, we're 3 times the field because we have him in 100% of our one single entry, right? So that's what Andrew's referring to here with 2 sides to leverage, having less than the field, but also having more. But you can see here, we think that Seattle is going to be pretty chalky at the moment. San Diego on DraftKings, maybe less so, maybe probably because they're so freaking expensive over here. So maybe that's the leverage point for this particular lineup for a single entry. You play the most expensive pitcher, you play this value stack in the form of Seattle, and you get access to a high ceiling team that maybe doesn't have a lot of ownership in the form of the Padres on DraftKings, right? We do the same thing here, maybe switch some of the players around. This time it's KC as the small stack. This time it's Toronto. Now we're doing a big stack of KC. So you can see we find those little micro edges here. And we kind of just really need just one on the single entry contest. So hopefully that helped answer your question, Andrew. I see another question just rolled in here. Don't know if I got it that perfectly. So if there's still some confusion or some clarifying questions there, just reach out, let me know. I think I kind of was able to get at the bulk of that question, but just let me know. One more question here from Christopher here. Do you think it's wise to use different entry settings for what you're playing, or just run top max or 150, or pick the top one and top 10 or 20 or so forth for your entries? Yeah, so I mean, there's a few different approaches to that. I think it kind of depends on how many lineups you're building overall. If you're playing, like using the same example here, if you're playing 5 single entry contests, right, you can almost assuredly make 5 profitable different lineups. And I think you spread out your risk a little bit while still having the upside of taking down any one of those contests by building 5 and entering them into each contest, right? And even, up to 20 lineups, right? Like if you're playing multiple different 20 maxes, like maybe you're playing the dime and the quarter and the $1, it may make more sense to spread out some risk there and build 60 lineups. You reduce your overall upside there because probably only one's going to win. You also introduce some just variance there because the best lineup could be in the lowest dollar contest. But you manage to spread out some risk. You give yourself a greater chance at winning something. And I think that's definitely kind of the better approach. Once you get up to playing a 150 max and maxing it out, I think you start to get to that point where there is a legitimate question of, can you continue to build more profitable lineups, right? On a really big slate, like a big 15 gamer like we had yesterday, maybe you can max out 2 different 150 maxes, 300 total lineups, and still be building high positive EV profitable lineups. Maybe not, right? It's difficult to say. I typically, where my kind of line is when I hit that 150 max, I like to think about that as my kind of pool of lineups I'm using for the slate, right? It also just becomes very hard to just kind of like think about and manage exposures for 300 lineups. At some point, I think you kind of need to cut that off and dial it in and say, I'm building 150. And then from there, maybe you're using the rank method of the entry editor to do what Christopher is describing here. And kind of like your number 1 lineup gets entered into all your single entries, and it's the first lineup in all the other multi-entry contests. And then your top 2 and 3 lineups get added along with lineup number 1 into your 3 entry maxes, and your top 20 lineups go into all your 20 maxes, right? Because you've built a set of 150 lineups. That's what you're going into the slate with. You don't think that there are lineups that can be built that are profitable in the 200, 300 range, right? And you're getting additional action in the form of single entries and 3 entry maxes on your highest saber score lineups. So those are kind of the 2 approaches. I would say until you get up to maxing a 150 max in your actual lineup portfolio, it probably makes more sense for you to spread out. You have to live with the knowledge that your best lineup can potentially be in the cheapest dollar amount contest. You might miss the min cash on the $25 single entry and bank the $1 single entry, but that's still a great return on the $1 single entry, and it happens. But you spread out your risk overall. It'll be better for you in the long term until you get up to somewhere around, I would say, 150. But maybe it's 300. Maybe you can max like the 50-cent mini-max and the $1 mini-max, all unique lineups, and be profitable and like build 300 truly profitable lineups that belong in the contest. Depending on the slate, maybe not. I cap mine at 150. So at 150, at 150 lineups is when I start really getting a lot of I will start getting additional action on the top lineups in the pool. Sometimes at 20, but mostly at 150. So cool. Just a couple minutes left here. I don't see any other questions that have trickled in, guys. Just one last reminder. Max and I on here tomorrow talking overall lineup building strategies for baseball DFS, right? A lot of the same things we've been talking about recently. We're going to continue kind of diving in, trying to pull a lot of these concepts together about different ways that you can build effective lineups and use all the different things that SaberSim has to offer, whether it's editing projections or messing around with ownership or tweaking exposures to add value here and to build successful lineups. So really excited to talk about that. If you have any questions, I would say, honestly, if you just have questions about baseball DFS, it's probably a great time next 24 hours or so to ask them in the Office Hours channel in Slack or at email at support@sabersim.com, and we'll talk about them a little bit live on show tomorrow. And then again, it is going to be sad for me, but no Office Hours on Friday here. And then I will be away here until a week from today on Wednesday. So you guys got me back on Wednesday. Andy will be taking care of you all on Monday and Tuesday. We're taking the day off Friday, but we'll just keep it going here. Again, a huge thank you to everybody that has been making this show possible so far by asking questions, by watching this either live or on the recording, by participating in this. It's been a lot of fun so far. We've gotten some great feedback on our content here that is continuing to kind of grow. So if you have any feedback at all, any constructive criticism or positive feedback, or if you've been enjoying it, just let us know by email or popping something into Slack. We will continue to get a little bit better. So with all that, I guess I will talk to you guys tomorrow for that strategy session, and enjoy the slate tonight. Enjoy all the games tonight, and we'll talk to you then. See ya.